Hello, and welcome to the next installment of Books on Trial, where we take a look at unpopular or controversial books, both fiction and non-fiction, and try to understand what makes them tick, what their appeal was, and why there was such a backlash to them. And the subject of today's video is 2011's Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. Now, I've often heard this book described as Twilight for dudes, because, like Twilight, it was initially extremely popular. Let me read some of the advanced praise for this novel. The pure, unfettered brain scream of a child of the 80s, like a dream my 13-year-old self would have had after binging on Pop Rocks and Coke. I couldn't put it down, says Charles Ardai, Edgar Award-winning author and producer of Haven. I was blown away by this book. Ernie Cline has pulled the raddest of all magic tricks. He's managed to write a novel that's at once serious and playful, that is as fun to read as it is harrowing. A book of ideas, a potboiler, a game within a novel, a serious science fiction epic, a comic pop culture mashup. Call this novel what you will, but Ready Player One will defy every label you try to put on it. Here, finally, is this generation's neuromancer, writes Will Lavender, New York Times bestselling author of Obedience. And lastly, John Scalzi says, imagine that Dungeons and Dragons and an 80s video arcade made hot, sweet love and their child was raised in Azeroth. If you're not already experiencing a nerdgasm at the thought, I don't want to know you. Whoa, settle down there, Scalzi. Maybe you should stop binging TV tropes and write something that's actually readable. I'm sorry, that was uncalled for. The whole premise of this series is that we are going to avoid snarkiness and snideness, because in a court of law, if the judge is making fun of you, you've probably screwed up really badly. And much like Twilight, Ready Player One's popularity was soon followed by a very strong backlash. But why? Why did people turn on this novel? First of all, what is this book actually about? Well, Ready Player One takes place in a dystopian future where this eccentric billionaire named James Halliday has created the Oasis, a huge combination of an MMO and a virtual reality world that has become incredibly popular. Now, James Halliday had no heirs, so to determine who inherits his vast fortune, he comes up with a game within the Oasis, an Easter egg hunt. And the novel helpfully informs us that the term Easter egg refers to how video game developers back in the day would try to sneak their credits into the game because their higher-ups wouldn't let them do so. Whoever finds this Easter egg will inherit Halliday's vast fortune, but to find the Easter egg, they first have to locate 3 keys, and finding the 3 keys means understanding Halliday's nostalgia, because he grew up in the 80s and has a tremendous affection for that decade. Of course, in the recorded will, Halliday says that he didn't have time to playtest the whole game before he died, so he's not even sure that it's even possible to win it, which is a rather nice touch if I do say so myself. So with billions of dollars on the line, the Oasis is suddenly swarmed with egg hunters, or gunters as the story calls them, who are suddenly obsessed with 1980s pop culture, effectively becoming nostalgic for another man's nostalgia. And one of these gunters is our protagonist, Wade Watts, who lives in a stack of mobile homes in rather dismal conditions. But fortunately for Wade, the Oasis provides an escape. He writes, maybe it isn't a good idea to tell a newly arrived human being that he's been born into a world of chaos, pain, and poverty just in time to watch everything fall to pieces. I discovered all of that gradually over several years, and it still made me feel like jumping off a bridge. Luckily, I had access to the Oasis, which was like having an escape hatch into a better reality. The Oasis is the setting of all my happiest childhood memories. When my mom didn't have to work, we would log in at the same time and play games or go on interactive storybook adventures together. She used to have to force me to log out every night because I never wanted to return to the real world, because the real world sucked. Now, I am not going to do that thing that a lot of YouTube critics do where they go through something chapter by chapter or scene by scene and just pick apart every single thing wrong with it, because that's just going to bloat the runtime of this video. Instead, I'll just say that it should not come as a surprise to you that Wade Watts eventually wins the prize. So, what is the appeal of this novel? Why was it so popular? Well, it should be pretty obvious that it's because of the nostalgia. This entire book is Ernest Cline saying, "Hey, do you remember Ghostbusters? Do you remember Back to the Future?" And yes, I understand fully the appeal of nostalgia. I mean, for me, it's not so much the 80s but the 90s, but when I go and watch cartoon intros from shows during the 90s, which you can find all over YouTube, I just get that warm feeling of remembrance, thinking back to getting up every Saturday morning to watch Garfield Friends or playing Super Mario World. But I also feel a tinge of sadness, knowing that you can never really go back to that time as much as you want to. And yes, nostalgia can be comforting, but it's also kind of a trap in a way. And to the book's credit, it does hint at the idea of maybe waxing nostalgic when the whole world is on fire is a bad thing. But beneath all that, there is something more sinister about this book, something far less wholesome than just, "Hey, do you remember the 80s?" And that is a kind of nerdy resentment. If you want to know what I'm talking about, here's a passage that was basically the aha moment for me when I was reading this novel. I'd attended school in the real world up until the 6th grade. It hadn't been a very pleasant experience. I was a painfully shy, awkward kid with low self-esteem and almost no social skills, a side effect of spending most of my childhood inside the Oasis. Online, I didn't have a problem talking to people or making friends, but in the real world, interacting with other people, especially kids my own age, made me a nervous wreck. I never knew how to act or what to say, and when I did work up the courage to speak, I always seemed to say the wrong thing. My appearance was part of the problem. I was overweight and had been for as long as I could remember. My bankrupt diet of government-subsidized sugar and starch-laden food was a contributing factor, but I was also an Oasis addict, so the only exercise I usually got back then was running away from bullies before and after school. To make matters worse, my limited wardrobe consisted entirely of ill-fitting clothes from thrift stores and donation bins, the social equivalent of having a bullseye painted on my forehead. Even so, I tried my best to fit in. Year after year, my eyes would scan the lunchroom like a T-1000, searching for a clique that might accept me. But even the other outcasts wanted nothing to do with me. I was too weird even for the weirdos. And girls? Talking to girls was out of the question. To me, they were like some exotic alien species, both beautiful and terrifying. Whenever I got near one of them, I invariably broke out into a cold sweat and lost the ability to speak in complete sentences. For me, school had been a Darwinian exercise, a daily gauntlet of ridicule, abuse, and isolation. By the time I entered 6th grade, I was beginning to wonder if I'd be able to maintain my sanity until graduation, still 6 long years away. And this passage really stuck out to me because, in a way, it mirrors my own experience in elementary school, that's kindergarten to grade 8. You see, back then, I was a nerd. Imagine the most stereotypical Hollywood idea of a nerd, and that was me. You know, tall, gangly, skinny, physically and socially awkward, wearing glasses, the whole thing. Now, I was not bullied in the way that Hollywood and TV typically depicts bullying. No one shoved me into lockers, no one beat me up for my lunch money, no one dunked my head in a toilet and gave me a swirly. No, that did not happen. There was no physical component to it. But It was made very clear to me very early on that there is a club for the cool kids and I wasn't in it, that I would never be in it, and that if I tried to get into it, it was only more proof that I should not be in it. Now, as an adult, it's easy to dismiss this as the kind of playground bullshit that kids get up to, but when you're a child, that playground, that schoolyard, that is your entire world, and you're there for, 8 or 9 years? That's an eternity as a child. So, these constant ego blows, they hurt you. They hurt a lot. So what are you gonna do? Just sit there and take it? Well, if you're like me and a lot of other nerds, you coped with this by cultivating an identity around the idea that you are intellectually superior. You might not be cool, you might not be attractive, you might not be athletic, and you certainly don't have a girlfriend, but you're smarter than those assholes making fun of you. And why? Because I was into smart, nerdy stuff, because I played video games, because I watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, because I was into science and all that nerdy, smart people stuff. I still remember the exact spot on the route home from school where I just, out of the blue, decided, hey, I'm smarter than all these assholes. I don't have to put up with any of this. Because people who are ostracized, people who are bullied, will often take those hobbies of theirs and turn them into a shield of superiority, a cudgel to be used against all the people who are making fun of them. Again, I know because I was such a person. And sure, when you're a kid, this might be an acceptable coping mechanism, but I see way too many people, way too many adults who never move on from this, who are still stewing in their own bitterness and resentment that the world has not recognized them as a genius. Here's a few examples of such behavior that I pulled from the internet. I'm guilty of sometimes feeling exhausted by moral commitments, but then I remember there are people out there who actually sincerely care about people, like conceptually, as opposed to individual persons or specific deserving groups of people, and man, that must be tough. Like, I consider it a moral victory. I can live on this miserable, internally combusting space rock surrounded by psychotic apes and not constantly wish for everyone I don't personally care for to just spin off into space. Like, my indifference to most of humanity is effort. I have no fucking idea what it takes to be one of those, you know what's great? Just the idea of human beings, even the crummy ones, people. That's some bodhisattva level shit I just can't even wrap my head around. Or I mean, maybe they just don't have a sense of smell. I'm a big fan of the honest and blunt approach. An internet reader has a right to visit a game site and read, did Oblivion really suck or what? Or Molyneux has gotta be on drugs, don't you think? Instead, every journalist pretends that Oblivion was a 10 out of 10 brilliant masterpiece, that Molyneux isn't a lying old kook, and that Dungeon Siege wasn't a screensaver. Then Chris Taylor says that he's making Space Siege even simpler, and everyone nods in agreement. Right on, man. It's about time someone makes games for the amputees. Bravo. And no, I don't really care who'd think what and how my comments would affect sales. I'm making this game on the bold assumption that there are some people out there who are interested in complex games that aren't made for retards. By the way, did I mention that I was the editor of RPG Codex for 4 years? Perhaps you've read my Oblivion review and other critically acclaimed articles/interviews. Now you probably understand where I'm coming from a bit better. There is a large graveyard filled with my enemies. I do not wish to add to it, but will if given no choice. Those who pick fights with me do so at their own peril, but maybe this is their lucky day. In fact, I'd say that Elon Musk is probably the best example of where this sort of bitterness and resentment can lead, because he is someone who has very clearly never moved on from adolescence, has never matured past that point, and is making all of his unresolved childhood issues the problem of not only the United States, but the entire world. His ego is not merely weak, it is a delicate, fragile thing that must be constantly massaged and reassured that yes, he is funny, yes, he is an edgy meme lord, yes, he is a brilliant visionary genius, a real-life Tony Stark that's going to save humanity. He cannot abide mockery at all. This is like a documented fact, because every time someone makes fun of him, and that's pretty much everyone these days, it just reminds him of all of that childhood bullying, all of that teasing and mocking and put-downs and all that. And just like James Halliday in Ready Player One, he is, of course, a eccentric tech billionaire. But personally, it took me a long time to realize that no, I am not intellectually superior because I'm good at video games. I am not smarter than everyone just because I watch Star Trek or because I'm into science, and I'm certainly not smarter than other people because I don't believe in God. Oh boy, did it take me a long time to learn that one. And when you read Ready Player One, you just see this, or maybe feel this bitterness lurking beneath the surface. And if I could add in something as evidence, Ernest Cline actually wrote a poem called Nerd Porn Auteur. I will not recite the entire thing, but here are some selections from it. I've noticed that there doesn't seem to be any porno movies that are made for guys like me. All the porn I come across was targeted at beer-swilling, sports bar-dwelling alpha males. Men who like their women stupid and submissive. Adult films are populated with these collagen-injected, liposuction women, many of whom resorted to surgery and self-mutilation in an attempt to look the way they have been told to look. These aren't real women, they're objects, and these movies aren't erotic, they're pathetic. These vacuum-headed fuck bunnies don't turn me on, they disgust me. And it's not that I'm against pornography. I mean, I'm a guy, and guys need porn. Fact. Like a preacher needs pain, like a needle needs a vein, guys need porn. I want the girl in the tweed skirt and the horn-rimmed glasses. Betty Finnebowski, the valedictorian. Oh yes. First, I want to copy her trig homework, and then I want to make mad, passionate love to her for hours and hours until she reluctantly asks if we can stop because she doesn't want to miss Battlestar Galactica. Summa cum laude, baby. That's what I call erotic. There should be fuck films for my nerd brethren of all sexual orientations. Gay nerd porn flicks with titles like Dungeons and Drag Queens. This idea is a fucking goldmine. I am gonna make millions, because this country is full of database programmers and electronics engineers, and they aren't getting the loving they so desperately need. Now, there is a lot to unpack here, several suitcases worth in fact, but notice how he tries to act like he's some sort of ally, but he still reduces women to their appearance, to the point where if he doesn't find a woman attractive, then she's not a real woman, apparently. There are apparently smart women and dumb women, and if you're a smart woman, then you look a certain way, and if you're a dumb woman, then you look a certain way. The idea that a busty blonde could also be a nuclear physicist is evidently lost on him. But beyond that, notice this sort of undercurrent of bitterness and resentment here, like, oh, us nerds, us smart people, we're not getting the love we deserve. It really is that attitude of girls only want to date dumb jocks and assholes and not nice guys like me. And you know who thinks like that? Teenage boys who don't know any better and incels. Also, note how Ernest Cline associates intelligence with hobbies, like watching Battlestar Galactica. This stuff is just, nerd culture just marinates in this idea that the things you do, whether it's playing video games, complex video games, or playing Dungeons and Dragons, or watching science fiction, that is a marker of intelligence, of intellectual superiority. Again, I know this because this was how I thought, and it took me a while to mature past that. Now, this is both the appeal and the reason for the backlash behind Ready Player One. The appeal of the novel is that it looks at you and says, hey, you, nerd, getting picked on, getting bullied in school, getting laughed at, what if you and your hobbies and your talents made you the most important person in the world? It's the exact same appeal that lies behind novels such as Harry Potter or Ender's Game. So that was the appeal, but what about the backlash? Now, not to put too fine a point on things, but I really think society turned on the kind of guy I just mentioned, the self-pitying male nerd with a deep-seated sense of aggrieved entitlement. In fact, there was a word for that kind of guy: neckbeard, and it's impossible not to be reminded of that stereotype as you read through Ready Player One. But beyond that, the novel's engagement with 1980s pop culture and nostalgia in general is just shallow. It's little more than the author saying, "Hey, remember this?" I mean, yeah, but so what? Ready Player One never really engages with the themes or deeper meanings behind the stuff it's referencing, and as an example, there's a point in the story where Wade jumps into a recreation of Blade Runner. Blade Runner was referenced in the text of Anorak's almanac no less than 14 times. It had been one of Halliday's top 10 all-time favorite films, and the film was based on a novel by Philip K. Dick, one of Halliday's favorite authors. For these reasons, I'd seen Blade Runner over 4 times and had memorized every frame of the film and every line of dialogue. As I rode the elevator down to the 440th floor, I powered on my armor and drew my guns. 5 security checkpoints stood between the elevator and the room I needed to reach. Unless the template had been altered, 50 NPC Tyrell security guard replicants would be standing between me and my destination. The shooting started as soon as the elevator doors slid open. I had to kill 7 skin jobs before I could even make it out of the elevator car and into the hallway. The next 10 minutes played out like the climax of a John Woo movie, one of the ones starring Chow Yun-fat like Hard Boiled or The Killer. I switched both of my guns to autofire and held down the triggers as I moved from one room to the next, mowing down every NPC in my path. The guards returned fire, but their bullets pinged harmlessly off my armor. I never ran out of ammo, because each time I fired a round, a new round was teleported into the bottom of the clip. My bullet bill this month was going to be huge. Alright, here's the problem with this. You see, Blade Runner is not a story about heroes and villains. Deckard is not a good guy. In fact, he's actually kind of a horrible person. I mean, his job is finding and executing runaway slaves because the replicants are slaves. And sure, the replicants in the Blade Runner movie do some terrible things, but it's all in the service of a very understandable goal. They don't want to die. And all of this nuance, this moral ambiguity, it all goes right over Ernest Cline's head, and he just turns it into, well, a video game, basically. But there's something beyond the shallowness of the nostalgia, and that is a very simple fact, that nostalgia isn't just about the movies or the TV shows or the video games you played, it was about who you were at the time. Let me explain. You don't miss playing GoldenEye 007, right? Instead, what you miss is hanging out with your friends, going to a sleepover where their parents order you in pizzas, and then staying up until the late hours playing the 4-player multiplayer with your best friends. And now you're an adult, your friends have scattered to the wind, and you just don't have experiences like that anymore, and it makes you kind of sad. Nostalgia is always bittersweet, but you don't get that in Ready Player One because Wade's nostalgia isn't even his own. He's not thinking about his own childhood when he goes into simulations of things like Back to the Future. No, he's nostalgic for another man's nostalgia, and thus it's all sort of empty, and perhaps the novel could have gone somewhere with this theme, but it really only scratches the surface. And what's more, when I look back at the stuff I enjoyed as a child, the stuff I fondly remember, sure, it's easy to look back at the big things that everyone remembers. Like, if I want to talk about gaming in the 90s, anyone can say something like, "Hey, do you remember Ocarina of Time? Do you remember Final Fantasy VII?" Yes, of course, everyone remembers that, and these games are still beloved today, but what about the lesser known things? What about the shows that barely anyone remembers but which you recall fondly? Like, when I was a kid, I loved this show, Captain Star. I think it only ran for 13 episodes, and I don't know if it even aired outside the country, and no one I've ever met ever seems to remember it, but I loved it. Or what about the games that you only played because you went to rent a game from the store and they didn't have the one you wanted, so you had to pick something else? There are tons of games like this, and sure, they might not be hailed as classics, but I'm sure they meant a lot to quite a few people. In short, nostalgia is very personal, but in this story, it's just all very impersonal. And as a result, Ready Player One is just a forgettable nothing of a book. And what's worse, it's probably going to age into utter irrelevance. In fact, it probably already has, because if you're a Gen Z or someone of that age, then it's likely just going to be incomprehensible to you. A barrage of 1980s pop culture that your dad probably loves or something. Anyway, I'm rambling, and that means it's time to wrap this up. Stay tuned for the next episode of Books on Trial, where we are going to get extra spicy with E.L. James' 50 Shades of Grey.